Welcome to Fast Talk Laboratories, your source for the science of cycling performance.
Well, welcome back to another tips session. I'm here with Coach Ryan Kohler. How you doing, Ryan?
Great.
Good. Today we are talking about how to measure or see cardiac drift in your rides. We've been talking a lot about cardiac drift lately. We actually did an episode of the podcast with Dr. Coyle, who is a legend in exercise physiology, and talked with him about, so it's actually cardiovascular drift and what that means. We've been asked a lot about that. People want to see that. I am a big believer that as long as you are hydrating effectively, cardiovascular drift is a sign of your aerobic fitness. And we talked about how if you're out doing a long ride, if somebody is lacking aerobic fitness, you're going to see that cardiovascular drift quite rapidly, and you see it quite large. So that's where, to give you a quick explanation, if you are watching your power, watching your heart rate, and you're riding at a steady power, you're going to start seeing that heart rate drift up. And that's why it's literally called cardiovascular drift. A really fit, if you took like a Tour de France level athlete, they could go out and do a 6-hour ride, and the power, so if they're, let's say, doing that 6-hour ride at 220 watts, their power near the start of the heart rate near the start of that ride, it's going to be pretty much the same as it is at the end of that ride at that same wattage. You took somebody who doesn't have the same fitness, they went out and did the same 6-hour ride, they might be starting at 120 beats per minute, and by the end of that ride at the same power, they're 145, 150 beats per minute. And that's important because A, it's an indicator of your fitness. B, it also means that if you don't adjust your ride, you're training very different energy systems at the end of that ride than you are at the beginning of that ride.
Well, I know this is a hot topic. We've talked a lot about this. So yeah, I mean, for the athletes listening to this and saying, oh, well, I see that happen, 45 minutes into my ride or an hour into my ride, what do I do next? How do we accommodate that? If we have a 4-hour ride planned, is it a matter of do we just dial the power back and then control by heart rate? Or, should we say, okay, well, should I ride a certain amount of time beyond that too, to get the best adaptations?
Right. So if you're going too hard, you're going to see that cardiovascular drift quite early. So for example, if you're just doing threshold intervals, you're going to see it 20 minutes into your ride. If you're doing a long ride and you're doing it effectively, most people can get through a few hours before they really start to see it. My general recommendations to my athletes is, A, control the ride, make sure you're staying in that zone 1 in a 3-zone model or below your aerobic threshold. And when you start seeing that cardiovascular drift, which is hopefully a couple hours in, you'll see a little bit, but there's a point where you can really go, wow, look at my heart rate shoot up. Or if you're trying to keep your heart rate steady, wow, look at my power just plummet. I tell my athletes, ride another 30 to 45 minutes past that point. Or if you're like me frequently, you're way up in the mountains, you have 3 hours home and you got nothing else that you can do except ride it out.
So you force yourself into those situations of, 3
I
hours
put myself
left.
in a lot of bad places. So yeah, that's a do as I say, not as I do. Don't be an idiot. And I am an idiot frequently. But yes, if you are properly controlling your ride, you probably have a sense of where that point is and just time it so that when you start to see that, if you're holding your heart rate steady, which is what I recommend, so you're continuing to work the same system, when you start to see that power plummet, this is the time to go, okay, let's start heading home. So the question is, how do you measure cardiovascular drift? There's a few ways. So I'm going to show you first in TrainingPeaks some of the basic ways to do it. Here is a good hard ride I did last summer where I throttled myself, and I definitely had a lot of cardiovascular drift. So one of the simplest things to look at is this PW:HR. So that basically just stands for power to heart rate. What it does is it takes the first portion of your ride and the last portion of the ride, looks at the heart rate relative to, I believe, normalized power. In that first part, looks at the power, the heart rate relative to normalized power in the second half, and basically says, what's the change? So with me, you're seeing a 15.45% change. That's big. That means I was limping home by the end of this ride. So sometimes I like to do that. That was the purpose of this ride. That's why you'll even see the name of this ride was Killer Boulder Ride. Because when you're doing big stage races and long races, there is a bit of a benefit to that, just not something to do that frequently. So that's one of the easiest ways. Another really easy way is simply, I actually can't do it on this ride because you see my heart rate and power are quite variable with the climbing. But let me take a different ride in TrainingPeaks. Here's one that I did with Chris. Chris and I went out with one another and tried to do a steady ride and see if we could destroy one another, and we were quite successful. Though you notice on this one, my cardiovascular drift is less. So 10%. Still pretty big. We were not talking nearly as much at the end of the ride as we were at the beginning. But here you can kind of take a look at this and go, here's kind of a steady portion with where the power is relatively steady. I can take that segment, go, average power was about 223, heart rate was 140. Then I can go later in the ride, find something that's hopefully about the same power. So that's a little lower power. Take that little segment there. So there's 216, power's lower, but you can see heart rate's higher, 146. So you can see heart rate is drifted up relative to the power. It's one of the ways to look for it. That's some of the most simple ways to do it. Let's jump over to WKO and I'll show you a little more sophisticated ways of doing this. So now we're into WKO, and again, you can build some pretty sophisticated graphs in this. A lot of the other tools, such as Golden Cheetah, allow you to build very similar graphs. Well, let's start with this one down here. I'm going to zoom in on this. So we're looking at that same ride that I showed you where Chris and I kind of beat one another up. Going to zoom in. Now, this was a graph that I used originally. The gold is my power, the red is my heart rate. And you can see I just did a trend line here of my heart rate and my power. And you can see the heart rate's trending upwards, power's trending downwards. That's a clear sign that I was getting fatigued. It was steady over the course of the ride. And that gray line is the relationship of the heart rate to power. And you can see it's trending downwards, which is an indicator of cardiovascular drift. In WKO, they call it decoupling. So there's that 10.91%. Decoupling and the PW to HR are the same things, just different titles for the same thing. So here's a graph, like I said, another graph that you can use to give you a little more information. But the most sophisticated, and unfortunately this doesn't come with WKO, you have to build it, and it's a fairly complicated graph, is this one right here. So this takes the same concept, but looks at power relative to heart rate. Trying to think of how to simplify it. It is very complex math here, but it's basically taking percentage of your heart rate reserve to percentage of your FTP power and then using a very complex formula I won't get into. Looks constantly at where they are relative to one another. And you see this dotted line. That is your 1 point. And the idea here is when you are fresh, you should be right around 1, provided you're keeping all these metrics accurate. It also uses your 5-minute power to help figure this out. So you can look at the trend over the course of the ride and see that I started the ride right around 1. That was pretty good. It actually picked up a little bit, but still sitting right around 1. But as you're getting further and further and further into this ride, you can see this green line is really getting up above 1. And that is a big indicator of cardiovascular drift. Another couple interesting things to show are sometimes this can be a little bit fooled if you're on a really hilly route with lots of downhills, because you can see when I was descending, I dropped way below 1. Because it just doesn't quite know how to deal with the fact that my heart's going to keep beating even when I'm not pedaling the bike. Another thing to look at is when you take long rests. So here's basically we got to Chris's house. We stopped for a bit. I think we were there for about 30 minutes. Then I rode home, and you can see I'm right back down towards 1. So you can say, well, that's a good thing, take a rest. But my counter argument is going to be, if you're going out and doing these long rides and this is the system you're trying to train, and you want to push it a little bit, taking these long rests brings you back to normal. You're not stressing the system, so you don't get quite the same gain. So this is one of the reasons I am very against the stop at a coffee shop in the middle of a long ride.
Yeah, I mean, the green line here, I mean, it's pretty striking. You can easily tell, and it seems like, I mean, we have a whole range. We can go very sophisticated graphs and all the way down to just chunking up different parts of our ride and looking at power and heart rate. But yeah, you can really see the striking difference here late in that ride when you and Chris were really digging into one another there, and the changes. So yeah, I think it's kind of a, pick the right chart or the right tool for what you have is kind of what I'm getting from it. If you don't have access to this, I think we've got a couple methods that seem to work. Whereas if you see those lines trending away from one another, it's a great indicator. For athletes, dare I say it, who aren't training with power, is there a way to feel this? Can you feel this kind of start to happen during a ride too?
Absolutely. I mean, about how it feels when you're going a certain tense. I mean, simply if you're on the flats, you can use speed to a degree, but you can certainly tell, what your heart rate should be at when the ride feels a certain difficulty. And if you're looking down and going, well, it feels this way, but boy, my heart rate is not at all where I expect. Or likewise, you go, this feels really hard, but I'm chugging along at 12 miles an hour. These are the little indicators that you're struggling more.
Yeah, that's great. I think this is great to sort of tie in what's really happening with those sensations you feel in a ride. Give you more of that sort of intuitive feel when you go out next time.
Yep. And this is a ride I would not do a lot. You can see I spent a lot of time where I was already well into that cardiovascular drift. I won't lie. A lot of this was Chris and I were seeing who was going to crack first. And this little stretch over here when we were riding home on the flats, we weren't doing a lot of talking. We were both just taking our pulls going, please crack, please crack, please crack. Neither of us did. But when we got to Chris's house, we ate a lot of food. Now, to show you this is a ride I did with an athlete. It wasn't a long ride. I wanted to keep it easy. I didn't want to see any cardiovascular drift. And you can see here, this is an example of a ride that's just a good, steady endurance ride where I am sitting on that one line for the entire ride. There is no cardiovascular drift. You look down here, my decoupling is 2.57%. So I was not stressing or pushing myself here. And that's key. Some of your long rides, a lot of your long rides need to be this. Every once in a while doing that ride like what Chris and I did, it's a good thing, but it shouldn't be every single long ride.
Yeah, that seems to be the common issue, hurdle is just too hard too often.
Yep.
But yeah, that's a great looking graph there.
So probably a final question here is, how much of a rest is too much of a rest? And actually, this ride is a good example. I try to limit my rest to 10 minutes or under. So you can see there's a couple times on this ride where Chris and I stopped for food. So here's one. Actually, that one was a flat tire. Here's one where we stopped for food. Here's another one where we stopped for food. And you can see these are short enough. They're 10 minutes or less that when we get back on the bike, you ignore this as a descent, you're still seeing that cardiovascular drift. This is getting too long. So this was, I can't really see here, but I would say this was about 30 minutes. And you can see by the end of that, I was back down to kind of that baseline. So I tend to tell my athletes, if you want the full benefits of these rides, keep your rest to ideally 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the most. Ryan, any thoughts?
Just enough to get in and out of the store, get a snack, and keep moving, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.